So we're going to talk about this concept of ludonarrative dissonance and whether it's a useful concept, whether it's applicable to indie game designers, and then I want to talk more broadly about the relationship between game mechanics and game stories or themes. Because ludonarrative dissonance is really a games criticism term that comes out of, games writers trying to find ways to criticize AAA games for having this mismatch between their story and their gameplay. I think if we want to unpack it properly, we need to sort of start from thinking about whether it's a useful concept in the first place. So first off, what is ludonarrative dissonance? Narrative means a story told by someone, generally speaking. If a piece of media has a narrative, it sort of implies that it has a narrative voice. There is a character or someone telling us a story, and the ludo part of this word refers to ludic, which means game. So we're talking about a dissonance between the game and the story, where they don't go together, and dissonance sort of implies that it feels bad in some way. Dissonance is a term that we would normally associate with music and things being out of tune. Here it's described as a lack of harmony among musical notes. So we've got musical notes played together, some of them don't belong, and it sounds and feels bad. We also use dissonance for the second definition here, where it's a lack of agreement or harmony between people or things. So dissonance can just generally mean disagreement, and you would have heard this term cognitive dissonance, which is when someone is trying to hold two ideas in their head at the same time which do not fit together. And again, there is a general consensus that usually that means that they are having a bad time. It feels bad to experience cognitive dissonance, to be trying to reconcile these two ideas or experiences that just do not seem to go together. So by talking about a clash between the game and the narrative as dissonant, we're starting out from the point of view that this is maybe a bad thing and it causes some sort of bad experience for the end user of the game. Now, the first usage of this term that you probably would have heard of before is in Clint Hocking's 2007 essay about Bioshock, where he says, Bioshock seems to suffer from a powerful dissonance between what it is about as a game and what it is about as a story. He goes on to say that the game has two contracts in it. There's a ludic contract, i.e. what the game is kind of promising the player from a gameplay perspective. Seek power and you will progress. And that's a very common ludic contract that we are used to kind of making with a game when we sit down to play it. You sit down to play the game, you pause the game, on the pause screen there is an XP bar and a skill tree. All of this is stuff that sort of indicates to you that the game is going to be a power fantasy where you gradually gain more power. But then there is a narrative contract, which is like the agreement between the game and the player about what the story is, and here it is, help Atlas and you will progress. Now, I'm not going to get into loads of detail about this essay. I think if you find this interesting, you should go away and read it. I do think it's an interesting time capsule on games criticism at the time, because it actually starts with a paragraph saying, what I'm trying to do here is critique a game and not review it. If you think of the context here back in 2007, ludonarrative dissonance is an attempt to start coming up with terminology to talk about things that are maybe not working in games in a way that is kind of cultural and focused on the experience of playing the game, rather than the kind of stuff you used to get in consumer reviews of games, which was like, there are bugs or the graphics don't look very good, right? So it's an attempt to start applying sort of heavy literary analysis techniques to games. The probably more quoted version of this is in relation to Uncharted. So Jeffrey Mataluff is quoted in this 2009 Eurogamer article as saying, Uncharted has often been mocked for being about a supposedly likable rogue who just so happens to recklessly slaughter hundreds of people. And then you've got the response to this from the developer below, where in Uncharted 4 we get the addition of an achievement for defeating 1,000 enemies called ludonarrative dissonance, which is a very funny way of responding to that criticism. So again, we can see it happening in different AAA games here. The idea that you have a game that is about being a powerful, violent person who solves problems through violence, and yet there is something else in the game coming from the story element that is pushing against that and saying that that is bad or wrong. I think one of our first criticisms of this as a concept could be that this is not really unique to games. We have had decades and decades of media where a supposedly nice, kind character beats up dozens of characters, and there are lots of ways that they get around that in things like children's programs. If you think of stuff like the A-Team, there was always like characters getting thrown into barrels or knocked out by less violent seeming means than shooting them, right? The heroic character that kind of sneaks up on people and karate chops them and just knocks them out. All of that kind of stuff was Western media's attempts at having violent heroes that were kind of violent in the right way, if you think about it. But for a game to be narratively dissonant in the way that Hocking was talking about it, we need to have a clear sense of what the preferred or intended reading was. It's not just the fact that there is a story and a game and they don't go together, right? If we think about that Bioshock quote, it is much more that the game seems to have a point it's trying to make with its story, and then how the gameplay has been designed is sort of actively contradicting that or working against it and ruining it in some way. But I would encourage us to think more about who is feeling the dissonance and under what conditions. Who is experiencing this dissonance and what does it feel like? And is it actually a problem? Like in the Bioshock example, we can see how the game is trying to make a particular point and the gameplay is undermining that, but the degree to which people experience that and feel that is going to be different from person to person. The feeling of dissonance could depend on how much you're experienced with games, how desensitized you are to that dissonance. So if you take the Uncharted example, now someone who walks in who's never played a video game before and watches a cutscene from Uncharted where Nathan Drake is a lovely dude and then watches an action sequence, as someone who's not played this type of game before, they are going to experience this dissonance more strongly. They're going to go, this doesn't go together, right? Whereas someone who is used to playing AAA action games is going to be used to making sense of this disjunction between this idea of a sensitive hero and the idea of an unstoppable killing machine being the same person. Because when you're playing as them, they're not really a person. They're more like a vehicle to interact with the game via. The second point I think here is the ideological attitudes that the player has to the story content. Now, there are those of us who would have a problem with the idea of a violent hero full stop in the real world. And then there are people that believe in justified violence, just war, and all of that kind of stuff. So the idea of someone being inherently bad because they kill 1,000 people is subjective, and different people have different views on that. So again, that's going to be something that plays into whether they experience these games as containing a degree of dissonance. And then the last point, which I think is perhaps the most important here, is the player's orientation towards the game, and to what degree are they playing to play a game, and to what degree are they playing to experience a story? And, you know, the examples so far have been big AAA games, and the bigger and more ambitious a game gets, the more likely it is that it will kind of support different types of players, right? If you think of a massive MMO, for example, there are people that are there to socialize. There are people that are there to explore the environment. There are people that are there to accrue wealth and make a number go up. And the game is big enough and diverse enough in its mechanics and systems that it can support players that have a different kind of focus. And you could say the same thing about action-adventure games, which Uncharted and Bioshock both are. There are people that play them more as a story with some fighting in, and there are people that play them as shooter games that have annoying cutscenes that you have to skip. If you contrast this with smaller indie games, with a small indie game, you are much more likely to get games which are just about story or games which are just about the gameplay, because having both is more expensive. Having both requires you to put more time, effort, learning into doing all of those things. So you're unlikely to get a player who buys a visual novel and isn't interested in story, because all that game has to offer is story. And likewise, you are unlikely to get a player that buys a Sokoban block pushing game for the story content, right? All of this is to say that the idea of ludonarrative dissonance is really dependent on the idea that the game has some sort of point it's trying to make with its story, or some sort of message it's trying to get across with its story, and the game is undermining that in some way. And the classic examples of this tend to be along the lines of, being violent and seeking power and dominance is bad. Here is a game where you shoot everyone and level up, right? Now, I've put these guys here because I think they sort of represent developers in the AAA games industry actually acknowledging that maybe this is a problem and trying to address it in some way. So if you've played GTA 5, you will know that you have these 3 guys you can play as and you switch between them, which in some ways makes it very similar to the game Lost Vikings. You know, this is probably just Lost Vikings 2 when you think about it. A thing that was always a problem with GTA, particularly from sort of GTA 3 onwards, is they would make this serious story about a person and their troubles, and you would be like buying businesses, investing in businesses, getting involved in political scandals, all this type of stuff. But then there was always a fun element of the game that was just getting chased by police or climbing up the highest thing you can find and rocket launchering things. So what they did in GTA 5 was added in Trevor, this Johnny Knoxville looking fellow here, who is the character where it kind of makes sense if you do all that kind of stuff, right? So you're kind of free to play the game however you want as each of these characters, but you've now got a character you can switch to where there isn't narrative dissonance if you want to go on a rampage, because that's the kind of guy he is. Just one example of how, as a AAA series has evolved, they seem to have taken on board this idea of narrative dissonance and incorporated it into the narrative design of the game and the character design of the game. To stay on the topic of AAA games for a moment, this is some wonderful Skyrim players' Cabbage collection. You can see my green screen is playing around with it a little bit here. But this is here to symbolize the goofiness of Skyrim, right? And Skyrim is a game that has a relatively serious story about heroism and being the chosen one and taking sides in big political wars going on and stuff like that. And yet the game also allows you to do stuff like this, like create collections of cheese or cabbage or anything like that. That is clearly a form of ludonarrative dissonance if we go by the way that Skyrim is marketed, the very serious, grimdark kind of way that it's marketed. Then the ability to do Cabbage collection is another example of narrative dissonance, but it's what most of us would see as a positive example of narrative dissonance, because it's using the game to do something funny and that is kind of enjoyable in this silly way, which all comes back to this original definition of dissonance. Because if you think of something like cognitive dissonance, trying to hold 2 things in your head that don't go together and finding it uncomfortable, well, that's kind of also what happens when we make jokes and humour as well. A lot of laughter is drawn from the fact that we've put 2 things together that don't go together. So the idea of ludonarrative dissonance being inherently bad is a problem in itself, I would say. It's bad in the context of a game like Bioshock, where you've got a sort of auteur game director who is clearly trying to make some sort of point and perhaps failing at making that point. But the type of dissonance that leads to laughter and creativity isn't bad. Ludonarrative dissonance is a sort of neutral thing, and it can be experienced in ways that lead to us thinking something is weak and failing to make a point in a particular way, or it can lead to situations where we are experiencing joy and laughter. And then my other argument against the idea of ludonarrative dissonance, or against the idea of it always being bad, is that there are just so many examples of where we are just so used to it as players of games that it doesn't bother us anymore. This may be an example of a thing that does bother you, but I think by and large, no one has ever returned a game because of this issue. So the way that death is handled, spoilers for Final Fantasy VII, the idea that there is a kind of mechanical death in a game where characters can be revived. You can spend an item to revive them, you can take them to a priest and bring them back from the dead that way, but then there may be a point in the story at which a character dies and it is a story point, so that death is final. That is something that many of us have experienced in games and have maybe been slightly frustrated by, but have also just generally accepted as a sort of thing that happens in games because games are weird mishmashes of stuff that happens because of gameplay and stuff that happens because of the authorial intent behind a narrative. And I think if you look around, there are plenty of examples in games and in other culture of dissonance being a positive thing, right? So I've put Graveyard Keeper here and Cult of the Lamb as examples of games which are both cozy games and grim games at the same time, and where there is a productive relationship between those things. If Cult of the Lamb was just an edgy, dark game about running a cult, it would be a very different game. If it was just a cute game about being a lamb, it would be a very different game. But it's actually the dissonance between those two elements of its kind of creative direction that create the unique thing that people love. I've also put jazz legend John Coltrane on this slide for reasons that I hope you can just work out for yourself. Can games have a dissonance between story and gameplay if they don't have a story? Because a lot of the smaller games that you or I will be working on don't have cutscenes. They don't have a lot of the direct storytelling stuff in that we would think of as story. And this is where I want to think about what narrative means generally in games. Because if you dig into it in narratology, the academic study of narrative, there are different definitions of what a narrative can be in the first place. So the strict definition is that narratives have to be told by a narrator, or there has to be a narrative voice of some kind. So if you think about it, when you're reading a book, there is always a narrative voice. There is a character talking to you, or there is an omniscient narrator, but there is always a narrator. And the fact that it is a story, a series of events being narrated to you, is what makes it a narrative. Now, there is a much more loose definition in games of what stuff could be considered as narrative. And this is basically any sort of representation of something that we can relate to something in the real world, or a trope from another media, like, you know, a wizard's hat. That would be a representational element that makes up some of the stuff we would think of as narrative, even if it's not really a plot involving events. So what I want to do for the last part of this video is to think less about narrative in terms of stories, because a lot of us are making games that don't have stories in, or don't have explicit stories that are series of events, and to instead think about themes and how game design or game mechanics and the themes can be in conflict with each other. And some of these things we've already talked about whether that dissonance or conflict is something good or something bad, or whether it depends on the context. So if you haven't heard this distinction before, when I talk about game genres, I'm talking about genres of gameplay. So I would personally never say that horror is a game genre. I wouldn't say that cozy is a game genre, because they don't tell me anything about how the game plays. Game genres are things like platformers, an RTS, a point-and-click adventure. A game genre is something that describes what you are doing in the game, and it may determine some things like the controls of the game, what you expect the player to be doing with their hands and their brain as they look at and interact with the game. Whereas the game themes are these representational things like a Western. From that theme we get a place, right? We get a time period, we get certain iconography, like certain types of hats. But I'd also put broader themes into this category, like cozy and horror as well, where there's like a general feeling or mode that is attached to the game. And I think this can be a really helpful distinction to make, because then you can start to think about which of these things work together in interesting ways, right? So for example, I have seen lots of people in the cozy game space complain that lots of cozy games are clones because they are farming games. And it's like, well, no, farming is a game genre where you do particular things and you try and achieve particular goals. And the reason why so many farming games are cozy games is because that theme goes very well with that genre. The reason why Graveyard Keeper and Cult of the Lamb stand out so much is because they have a slight dissonance between the themes and the genre. So this could lead us on to talking about ludothematic dissonance. So when the mechanics and the theme of a game don't fit. And this isn't a real term, I've just made it up because I can do that if I want. So if we think of it, about this less in terms of it being a story problem, like in the Hocking example where, Bioshock is a critical failure because the story is trying to make a particular point. If we think in terms of ludothematic dissonance, we can think more in terms of game design and how does a mismatch between the theme and mechanics produce something good, like Cult of the Lamb or Graveyard Keeper, or how does it create something bad, like an audience just not liking it or an audience not understanding it. So the first thing to understand is that the theme of your game is a mnemonic and it's a heuristic. And these are both difficult terms, but I need to introduce them both because they sort of relate to each other. So a heuristic is something that enables someone to discover or learn something for themselves. And the way this relates to theme in games is, if you take the example of, I have an item in my hand, and when I point it and click, it destroys something in the distance, right? That's an abstract concept. If I add the theme of that item is now a gun, you immediately understand how that is going to play out, how that is going to work in the context of the game. The fact that it is a gun sort of teaches you how to use it or what it's used for, right? So it's a heuristic. Now you could replace that gun with something else, like the game where you shoot with your fingers or a magic wand or whatever, but the thematic ideas that you attach to objects and mechanics in your game are going to teach people the game based on what they already know about other games, about the real world, about media in general. This is related to the idea of theme as a mnemonic because mnemonic basically means anything that helps you remember things. These are kind of related because the theme can be a heuristic where it teaches you what something does, or it can be a mnemonic where it reminds you what something does after you've been taught about it. Chess is a reasonably abstract game, but it does have a theme of two armies clashing in battle. And then when you get into the kind of design of the different pieces and their names given to them, the pawn is the simplest piece. It is the kind of cheapest piece in terms of the economy of the game. You've got lots of them. They are meant for trading and giving away. So the kind of theme of it being a sort of royal court or a royal army creates this hierarchy of the pieces that kind of tells you that your king and queen are most valuable and your pawns are the least valuable. So this is the theme of the game operating as a heuristic to teach you the game and as a mnemonic to help you remember the game. And then you can also start to think about like how does the like movement of the different pieces relate to what they're themed around. The knight can jump over things, and then again the more powerful pieces have a further range of movement, or they have a more unpredictable range of movement. It's not always one-to-one stuff that makes total sense, but you could think about the rook. It can move as far as it wants to on a lateral direction, and you could start to think of that as that's because someone can see from the top of the tower. However you make sense of that yourself, the point is all of this goes to make this easier to learn and remember than if these were just random abstract triangles and stuff like that. Another example of theme teaching how a game works that we can think of is something like a deck builder. Like a deck builder in a video game doesn't really need to contain a deck of cards, right? It could be anything. It could be discs. It could be any other metaphor, but we use the metaphor of a deck of cards because that teaches the player a certain amount of information about how this game is going to work. We know that cards go into a set and then you draw one out at a time and you get a random one from whatever's in that set. So even if you've never played a deck builder before, there's certain stuff that you get from the theme of a deck of cards that gives you an understanding of some of how this game is going to work, right? When we've got a deck of cards, we kind of know that the contents are randomized somehow. We know that it's got a finite amount in there and it's going to run out, and we know that there's probably variation in there because a deck of cards that were all the same card would be completely pointless. So in this context, I'm not even thinking of the theme of the game in terms of climbing up a tower, killing monsters, but the theme within the interface of using a deck of cards to explain the game mechanic of how the randomization works and so on. And then you can think of some of this stuff in relation to character design. There is a language to character design that we are used to sort of reading and interpreting as gamers. And if you don't use this language, people will get confused. So when Overwatch came out, it was kind of critically lauded for having a diversity of body shapes in it. But the way the body shapes can be read, if you take these two characters for an example, is that the big strong character is a tank that can take lots of damage, and the skinny character is like a stealth character that does lots of damage but can't take much damage, right? This is all thematic information that helps players look at the state of the game, see which characters are around, and predict how those characters are going to behave and what kind of is going on under the hood with those characters in terms of their abilities and other variables like their toughness or their health and that kind of stuff. If there was no theme here, and these characters were mechanically different, like they are in the game, but they looked identical, then we would have a problem in terms of the theme not doing its job to communicate the mechanics. 2 examples of games where you play as a scientist. We've got Gordon Freeman in Half-Life, we've got Morgan Yu in Prey. These are both science fiction games where you play as a scientist, and that kind of makes sense from a genre perspective. It's a science fiction story, so the protagonist is a scientist. But when you think about what these games are going for at a game design level in terms of the experience and the way the player is encouraged to play and to think, these are also games about experimentation and trial and error and, you know, really kind of critically looking at environments and working out how to solve puzzles and things like that rather than just blasting your way through everything. And that means that the kind of theme of having a protagonist who is a scientist is doing some communication to the potential player about what sort of game this is, right? If you had both those same games and the protagonist was like a big beefy Vin Diesel kind of guy, that would communicate that this is a game about shooting and punching, whereas having scientists as heroes communicates that it is a game that is about exploration and analysis and learning things, uncovering things. So all of this stuff, you've got the visual design of characters communicating stuff, and then you've got the kind of the role of the character or what they represent communicating things. These are all examples of really nice matching of themes with what the game is about mechanically. And then an example you've probably seen me mention before on this channel, just because I played Pacific Drive very recently and then went on and on about it. The theme can help to define the scope of a mechanic or a system. So the example I would give in Pacific Drive is, because it's a game about driving and looking after a car, you can have a crafting system that is only based around car-relevant materials, right? So although this game fits into the sort of survival crafting niche, the same niche as games like Subnautica or The Forest, we don't have to be able to harvest every single material in this game. And some of that comes from the science fiction theme of the game, and some of it comes from the car theme of the game. But the theme basically lets us say, all we're doing with our harvesting and building here is improving the car and the garage, so we don't need to be able to chop down trees. We don't need to be able to go down a mine and mine coal, right? These are things that people might expect within the genre, but the theme has a limiting effect on the scope of those mechanics, and that means the game can be a lot more focused, right? If you just made a survival crafting game and said, we're doing a survival crafting game, but you can't chop down trees, and you can't go down the mines and mine stuff, that would probably annoy people because their expectations wouldn't be met. But because we have the theme of looking after and upgrading a car, it suddenly makes sense that we have a more limited crafting system that only focuses on that. And just to give a broader example, let's say I'm working on a game, or I'm working with a team working on a game, and we're making a game that is about fantasy. It's a traditional fantasy game. You've got wizards, you've got knights, all of this kind of stuff. And that brings with it certain expectations about the systems that will be in that game. You know, we're going to have inventories, we're going to have leveling up, we're going to have different abilities to choose, and all of this kind of stuff. Now, let's say we make the decision to change the theme to being about superheroes instead of fantasy. This is a kind of thought exercise where you could think, okay, how does that change the scope of the different mechanics and the different systems? And because you're working within a genre space, you have to think about what people expect. So what do people expect from a Dungeons and Dragons fantasy type setting versus what do people expect from superheroes? So I can already see how changing the theme in that way would start to limit the scope of some of these things in a way that just like our scrapper from Pacific Drive example, starts to make sense of having a more limited scope. So the example I would give here is that superheroes are not constantly changing their outfits or upgrading their weapons. They have a signature outfit, and that means, hey, we can make something that is mechanically the same as what we were going to make before, but because we've replaced the theme, we can take out the entire system for loot and changing people's outfits, right? You might still want to customize the color of it or something like that, but the kind of Final Fantasy Dungeons and Dragons idea of every character having 50 pieces of loot that you collect over the course of the game and chop and change, it can go out the window, and players will be more receptive to that because their concept of this theme doesn't have a constant upgrading mill of items in it in the same way. To think of a similar problem from the other scale of when something is too limited, we've got what I call the fireball wizard problem. Now, let's say you make a game where your primary interaction as a player is throwing a fireball, right? And you think, well, I'm doing a magic thing, I'm throwing a fireball, so I'm going to make a game about being a wizard, right? The problem then is most players' expectations of wizards, or most fantasy fans' expectations of wizards, is that it's an intellectual archetype where the character has read lots of books and they know lots of different things. So although throwing a fireball is something we'd associate with magic and wizards, only being able to throw a fireball doesn't work, because a wizard who can only throw a fireball is not really what we think of as a wizard. It would have to be a really low-level wizard who hasn't learned much yet, or some other thing. So that's an example of where the theme, if we switch it, we might end up in something that is more agreeable for the audience, right? So a wizard who can only throw a fireball is a weak wizard by most people's understanding of what a wizard normally is able to do. But again, a superhero who can throw a fireball, well, that's a normal ability, and a superhero normally only has one or two things they do, right? There are other kind of characters you could think of who could throw a fireball and it would be really cool. But if your game is about a wizard and they can only throw a fireball, then you've got a problem with the match between your themes and your mechanics, because having a wizard that's limited to only one spell does not feel like a cool or aspirational character to most people who would play your game. Now, there are obviously some caveats here. Maybe it's something you play for laughs. Maybe the whole point of your game is an incompetent wizard who only knows one spell, and that's fine. But if you're going to play it for laughs, then the whole creative direction of your game needs to be pointing towards that, so people understand it's a joke. Because every time you make a joke to an audience who don't know you, you usually have to make the joke 2 or 3 times bigger than you think you do so that they know it's a joke, right? So I've used Rincewind from Discworld here as an example because he is a wizard protagonist who is an incompetent wizard, right? So you can have a fireball wizard if you've got an incompetent wizard, but in that case then you need to be making a funny game. And if you're not making a funny game, if you're making a power fantasy about running around shooting things where you're supposed to feel cool, then you either need a wizard that knows lots of spells because that's what people expect, or you need a different type of character that throws fireballs. And then a general point about all of this stuff that I come back to again and again on this channel, and I would encourage you to think about in relation to your own games, is that tight experiences, games that are well designed, they orient every element of what they're doing around the same desired feeling. So I've used Sonic the Hedgehog here as an example. The character, the environment, so many things are pointing in the same direction, right? It doesn't need to make sense that Sonic's world is made up of loop-the-loops that are really fun for Sonic to run around in, right? We don't care that there's a dissonance caused by that. It just means we have a really cool environment to use this character and their movement in. And then when you look at the character design and you look at kind of Sonic's attitude and everything, all of that is in line with a character who goes fast, a character who's a bit of a daredevil, all of this kind of stuff. Every element of your game, whether it's a mechanical element or a thematic element or the art direction, you kind of want to get them all pointing at the same thing, because unless you're going for a deliberate dissonance, which is kind of fun and productive, like the Cult of the Lamb example, which is very hard to pull off, the way to generally make an okay game, which is a good place to start from, is just to make sure everything is pointing in the same direction. The mechanics and the theme and the art style, everything is kind of trying to achieve the same sort of goal. I think of platformers and Metroidvanias as two genres that are often attempted by indie developers and frequently failed at. And a lot of that just comes down to this stuff. They didn't point everything in the game at the same feeling, right? Hollow Knight works because you're a cool little guy who is fun to move around, and the environment is kind of scary and mysterious and cool to explore, and all of the combat and the exploration and stuff in that game makes sense together. It goes together. I've seen so many attempted indie platformers and Metroidvanias where there's just not really a sense of what is supposed to be cool about the character or the world, or how any of it is supposed to fit together to form a cohesive experience. And this stuff is hard. I mean, even as I'm talking about it, I can sense that I feel a bit wafty and abstract, but once you've got past focusing on like little details of art and bugs in code and stuff like that, it is really this broad creative direction stuff where your game and your story, or your game and your theme, are interacting, which really kind of determines whether a game is successful or not in a lot of cases. I'm going to leave you with a couple of questions you can go away and ask yourself about your game. So we're doing homework this time, and these are: what do my players misunderstand or not enjoy about the game? Right? And this is a question you'll only be able to answer once you've started playtesting. So if you're not playtesting your game with people and watching them, then you're not going to be equipped to ask these questions yet. But if you know what your players don't understand, or what they don't seem to enjoy, even though you thought it was really cool and a good idea, is this related to this kind of mismatch we talked about, this mismatch between the game and the theme? And if you think about that relationship, if you think about the problem that you're having with your game, or the problem that your players are having with your game, there might be something you can do by moving the theme around and changing some of your assumptions about what the character should be or what the world should be, that will make the game make more sense, or be more enjoyable, or more appealing, or any other types of superlatives you can apply to it. And then coming back to the idea from earlier that sometimes dissonance is good, ask yourself if your game has opportunities to use that kind of positive dissonance in it. So can you use dissonance to create surprises or other types of emotional response? For example, laser guns don't fit thematically into Vampire Survivors, right? For your first hour or so of playing Vampire Survivors, it is about pixel art vampire hunters. All of the imagery and iconography and weaponry is drawn from this sort of fiction that we have around vampire hunting, and the idea of Catholic stuff being used to fight vampires. So a laser gun doesn't fit, and it wouldn't make sense to have it in there from the start. But having it in there as something that you reveal and explore later on is a fun surprise, because we've established what the game is about thematically, and then we're breaking it in a fun way that causes surprise, right? This is why games that have weird characters to unlock, or weird weapons to unlock, that are a bit anachronistic or don't fit into the setting, they tend not to do it at the beginning. They tend to do it as a reward when you're sort of halfway in or towards the end. And then to come back to some of the ideas from the superhero slide, would changing the theme or the backstory of your game have benefits? Here I'm cycling between sci-fi, high fantasy, superheroes. These are like really broad genres. You can be more specific than this. Think about those relationships between theme and mechanics, and how sometimes having a different theme can make your mechanics tighter or more focused. Is there a world where you change the theme or the backstory of your game and it makes the game more appealing to people because it's a more unique game, and makes it easier to make at the same time, right? Think of the superhero example where I said this game is easier to make than that game, because superheroes don't change their outfits and their weapons all the time. So by changing the theme, we reduce the sort of total amount of assets and the total amount of code needed to make the game, and we move out of a very crowded genre into a less crowded genre. I'm not saying that because I think it's the best idea and you should do it. It's just an example of the sort of thinking I think you should do and be open to doing in terms of like looking at your game as it currently is, and not being too married to whatever theme or story you have for it. We've covered a lot today. That's kind of all I have to say for now about these relationships between kind of gameplay and story, or gameplay and theme. I hope this has helped you think through some of these things. There are a lot of these things that are going to really, really vary depending on the type of game you're making. So If you found any of this particularly helpful, or if there's any of it that was confusing and you want to know more, please just feel free to leave any questions or comments and I will try and get back to them when I can. Also, follow this channel on Patreon if you're able to. You can follow me on there for free and just get my newsletter that comes out once a month, or the other free bits that I throw up on there. And let me know if there are any other related topics that you'd like me to cover on this channel.